From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. An Outside Interest by Ruth Rendell. Frightening people used to be a hobby of mine. Perhaps I should rather say an obsession, and not people but specifically women. Making others afraid is enjoyable, as everyone discovers who has tried it and succeeded. I suppose that has something to do with power. Most people never really try it, so they don't know. But look at the ones who do. Judges, policemen, prison warders, customs officers, tax inspectors. They have a great time, don't they? You don't find them giving up or adopting other methods. Frightening people goes to their heads. They're drunk on it. They live by it. So did I. While other men might go down to the pub with the boys or to football, I went off to Epping Forest and frightened women. It was what you might call my outside interest. Don't get me wrong. There was nothing, nasty about what I did. You know what I mean by that. I'm sure I don't have to go into details. I'm far from being some sort of pervert, I can tell you. In fact, I err rather on the side of too much moral strictness. Nor am I one of those lonely, deprived men. I'm happily married and the father of a little boy. I'm 6 feet tall, not bad looking, and I assure you, entirely physically and mentally normal. Of course, I've tried to analyze myself and discover my motives. Was my hobby ever more than an antidote to boredom? By anyone's standards, the life I lead would be classed as pretty dull. Selling tickets and answering passengers' queries at Anglo-Mercian Airways Terminal, living in a semi on Muswell Hill, going to tea with my mother-in-law on Sundays, and having an annual fortnight in a holiday flat in South Devon. I got married very young. Adventure wasn't exactly a conspicuous feature of my existence. The biggest thing that happened to me was when we thought one of our charters had been hijacked in Greece, and that turned out to be a false alarm. My wife is a nervous sort of girl. Mind you, she has a cause to be. Living where we do close to Highgate Woods and Queenswood, a woman takes her life in her hands, walking alone in those places. Carol used to regale me with stories. Well, she still does. At 5:20 in the afternoon, it was still broad daylight. He raped her and cut her in the face. She had to have 17 stitches in her face and neck. She doesn't drive, and if she comes home from anywhere after dark, I always go down to the bus stop to meet her. She won't even walk along the Muswell Hill Road because of the woods on either side. If you see a man on his own in a place like that, you naturally ask yourself, what's he doing there, don't you? A young man just walking aimlessly about? It's not as if you had a dog with him. It makes your whole body go tense and you get an awful sort of crawling sensation all over you. If you didn't come and meet me, I don't think I'd go out at all. Was it that which gave me the idea? At any rate, it made me think about women and fear. Things are quite different for a man. He never thinks about being afraid of being in dark or lonely places. I'm sure I never have, and therefore I got all this from Carol. I never considered how important this business of being scared when out alone might be to them. When I came to understand, it gave me a funny feeling of excitement. And then I actually frightened a woman myself, by chance. My usual way of going to work is to cut through Queenswood to Highgate Tube Station and take the Northern Line down into London. When the weather is very bad, I go to the station by bus, but most of the time I walk there and back, and the way through the wood is a considerable shortcut. I was coming back through the wood at about 6 one evening in March. It was dusk, growing dark. The lamps, each a good distance apart from each other, which light the paths, were lit, but I often think these give the place a rather more bleak and sinister appearance than if it was quite dark. You leave a light behind you and walk along a dim shadowy avenue towards the next lamp, which gleams faintly some 100 yards ahead. And no sooner is it reached an acid yellow glow among the bare branches, than you leave it behind again to negotiate the next dark stretch. I thought about how it must be to be a woman walking through the wood, and yes, I gloried in my maleness and my freedom from fear. Then I saw the girl coming. She was walking along the path from Priory Gardens. It came into my head that she would be less wary of me if I continued as I had been, marching briskly and purposely toward Wood Vale, swinging along and looking like a man homeward bound to his family and his dinner. There was no definite intent present in my mind when I slackened my pace, then stopped and stood still. But as soon as I'd done that, I knew I was going to carry it through. The girl came up to where the paths converged and where the next lamp was. She gave me a quick darting look. I stood there in a very relaxed way, and I returned her look with a blank stare. I suppose I consciously, out of some sort of devilment, made my eyes fixed and glazed and let my mouth go loose. Anyway, she turned very quickly away and began to walk much faster. She had high heels, so she couldn't go very fast, not as fast as I could, just strolling along behind her. I gained on her until I was a yard behind. I could smell her fear. She was wearing a lot of perfume, and her sweat seemed to potentiate it so that there came to me a whiff and then a wave of heady, mixed-up animal and floral scent. I breathed heavily. She began to run, and I strode after her. What she did then was unexpected. She stopped, turned around, and cried out in a tremulous, terrified voice, "What do you want?" I stopped too and gave her the same look. She held her handbag out to me. "Take it!" The joke had gone far enough. I lived around here anyway. I had my wife and son to think of. I put a Cockney voice. "Keep your bag, love. You've got me wrong." And then to reassure her, I turned back along the path and let her escape to Wood Vale and the lights and the start of the houses. But I can't describe what a feeling of power and, well, triumphant manhood and what's called machismo the encounter gave me. I felt grand. I swaggered into my house, and Carol said they had a premium bond come up. Since I'm being strictly truthful in this account, I'd better add the other consequence of what happened in the wood, even though it does rather go against the grain with me to mention things like that. I made love to Carol that night, and it was a lot better than it had been for a long time. In fact, it was sensational for both of us, and I couldn't kid myself that it was due to anything but my adventure with the girl. Next day, I looked at myself in the mirror with all the lights off, but the little tubular one over our bed, and I put on the same look I'd given the girl when she turned in my direction under the lamp. I can tell you I nearly frightened myself. I've said I'm not bad looking, and that's true, but I'm naturally pale, and since I'm thin, my face tends to be a bit gaunt. In the dim light, my eyes seemed sunk in deep sockets, and my mouth hung loose in a vacant, mindless way. I stepped back from the glass so that I could see the whole of myself, slouching, staring, my arms hanging. There was no doubt I had the potential of being a woman frightener of no mean caliber. They say it's the first step that counts. I had taken the first step, but the second was bigger, and it was weeks before I took it. I kept telling myself not to be a fool, to forget those mad ideas. Besides, surely I could see I'd soon be in trouble if I made a habit of frightening women in Queen's Wood on my own doorstep. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I remembered how wonderful I'd felt that evening, how tall I'd walked, and what a man I'd been. The funny thing was, what a lot of humiliating things seemed to happen to me at the time, between the Queenswood incident and the next occasion. A woman at the air terminal actually spat at me. I'm not exaggerating. Of course she was drunk, smashed out of her mind on duty-free scotch, but she spat at me, and had to stand in the middle of the ticket hall with all those tourists milling about and wipe the spittle off my uniform. Then I got a reprimand for being discourteous to a passenger. It was totally unjust, and strictly speaking, I should have resigned on the spot. Only I've got a wife and son, and jobs aren't easy to come by at present. There was all that and trouble at home as well, with Carol nagging me to take her on holiday with this girlfriend of hers and her husband to Menorca instead of our usual Salcombe fortnight. I told her straight we couldn't afford it, but I didn't like being asked in return why I couldn't earn as much as Sheila's Mike. My manhood was at low ebb. Then Sheila and Mike asked us to spend the day with them, Carol, Timothy, and me. They had been neighbors of ours, but had just moved away to a new house in one of those outer suburbs that are really in Essex. So I drove the three of us out to Theydon Bois and made my acquaintance with Epping Forest. There are 64 square miles of forest lying on the northeastern borders of London, but when you drive from the Wake Arms to Theydon along a narrow road bordered by woodland stretches of turf and undergrowth, little coppices of birch trees, you can easily believe yourself in the depths of the country. It seems impossible that London is only 14 or 15 miles away. The forest is green and silent, and from a car looks unspoiled, though of course it can't be. We passed a woman walking a very unguard-like dog, a tiny Maltese terrier. That gave me the idea. Why shouldn't I come out here? Why shouldn't I try my frightening act out here where no one knew me? 2 days after that, I did. It was spring, and the evening stayed light till nearly 8. I didn't take the car. Somehow it didn't seem to me as if the sort of person I was going to act, would have a car. The journey was awful, enough to deter anyone less determined than I. I went straight from work, taking the Central Line tube as far as Lawton, and then a bus up the hills and into the forest. At the Wake Arms, I got off and began to walk down the hill, not on the pavement, but a few yards inside the forest itself. I didn't see a woman on her own until I reached the house of Theydon and began the return trip. I had gone about 100 yards up again when she came out of one of the last houses, a young girl in jeans and a jacket, her hands in her pockets. It was clear she was going to walk to the Wake Arms, or so I thought. For a while I walked, keeping step with her, but unseen among the hawthorn and crab-apple bushes, the tangle of brambles. I let us get a quarter of a mile away from the house before I showed myself, and then I stepped out onto the pavement ahead of her. I turned around to face her and stood there staring the way I'd practiced in the mirror. She wasn't nervous. She was brave. She was only very briefly that she hesitated, but she didn't quite dare walk past me. Instead, she crossed the road. There's never much traffic on that road, and so far not a single car had passed. She crossed the road, walking faster. I crossed too, but behind her, and I walked along at the back of her. Presently she began to run, so of course I ran too, though not fast enough to catch up to her, just enough to gain on her a little. We had been going on like that for some minutes, the Wake Arms still a mile off, when she suddenly doubled back, hared across the road, and began running back the way she had come. That finished me for chasing her. I stood there and laughed. I laughed long and loud. I felt so happy and free. I felt so much all-conquering power that I alone, humble, ordinary, dull me, could inspire such fear. After that, I took to going to Epping Forest as a regular thing. Roughly speaking, I'd say it would have been once a fortnight. Since I do shift work, 4 till midnight, just as often as 10 till 6, I sometimes manage to go in the daytime. A lot of women are alone at home in the daytime and have no men to escort them when they go out. I never let it go more than 2 weeks without my going there, and occasionally I'd go more often if I was feeling low in spirits. For instance, or Carol and I had a row, or I got depressed over money. It did me so much good. I wish I could make you understand how much. Just think what it is you do that gives you a tremendous lift. Driving a car really fast, or going disco dancing, or getting high on something. Well, frightening women did all that for me, and then some. Afterward, it was like Christmas. It was almost like being in love. And there was no harm in it, was there? I didn't hurt them. There's a French saying, it gives me so much pleasure and you so little pain. That was the way it was for me and them, though it wasn't without pleasure for them either. Imagine how they must have enjoyed talking about it afterward, going into all the details like Carol did, distorting the facts, exaggerating, making themselves for a while the center of attention. For all I knew, they may have got up search parties, Husbands and boyfriends and fathers all out in a pack looking for me, all having a great time as people invariably do when they're hunting something or someone. After all, when all was said and done, what did I do? Nothing. I didn't molest them, or insult them, or try to touch them. I merely stood and looked at them and ran after them. Or ran when they ran, which isn't necessarily the same thing. There was no harm in it, or so I thought. I couldn't see what harm there could ever be, and believe me, I thought about this quite a lot, for I'm just as guilt-ridden as the rest of us. I thought about it, justifying myself, keeping guilt at bay. Young women don't have heart attacks and fall down dead because a man chases them. Young women aren't left with emotional traumas because a man stares at them. The oldest woman I ever frightened was the one with a Maltese terrier, and she was no more than 40. Saw her again on my 3rd or 4th visit, and followed her for a while, stepping out from behind bushes and standing in her path. She used the same words the girl in Queenswood had used, uttered in the same strangled voice. "What is it you want?" I didn't answer her. I had mercy on her and her little ineffectual dog, and I melted away into the woodland shades. The next one who asked me that I answered with professional gravity. "Merely collecting lichens, madam." It was proof enough of how harmless I was that there was never a sign of a policeman in that area. I'm sure none of them told the police, for they had nothing to tell. They had only what they imagined and what the media had led them to expect. Yet harm did come from it. Irrevocable harm and suffering and shame. No doubt by now you think you've guessed. The inevitable must have happened, the encounter that any man who makes a practice of intimidating women is bound to have sooner or later, when the tables are turned on him. Yes, that did happen, but it wasn't what stopped me. Being seized by the arm, hurled in the air, and laid out sprawled and bruised by a judo black belt was just an occupational hazard. I've always been glad, though, that I behaved like a gentleman. I didn't curse her or shout abuse. I merely got up, rubbed my legs and my elbows, made her a little bow, and walked off in the direction of the wake. Carol wanted to know how I managed to get green stains all over my clothes, and I think to this day she believes it was from lying on the grass in a park somewhere with another woman. As if I would. The attack on me teetered me. It didn't put me off. I let 3 weeks go by, 3 miserable, yearning weeks, and then I went back to the Wake Road one sunny July morning and had one of my most satisfying experiences. A girl walking not on the road, but taking a shortcut through the forest itself. I walked parallel to her, sometimes letting her catch a glimpse of me. I knew she did, for, like it had been with the girl in Queenswood, I could sense and smell her fear. I strolled out from the bushes at last and stood ahead of her, waiting, and she didn't dare approach me. She didn't know what to do. At length she turned back and I followed her, threading my way amongst the bushes until she must have thought I had gone, then appearing once more on the path ahead. This time she turned off to the left, running, and I let her go. Laughing the way I always did, out loud and irrepressibly, I let her go. I hadn't done her any harm. Think of the relief she must have felt when she knew she'd got away from me and was safe. Think of her going home and telling her mother or her sister or her husband all about it. You could even say I'd done her a good turn. Most likely, I'd warned her off going out in the forest on her own, and therefore protected her from some real pervert or molester of women. It was a point of view, wasn't it? You could make me out a public benefactor. I showed them what could happen. I was like the small electric shock that teaches a child not to play with the wires. Or that's what I believed, till I learned that even a small shock can kill. I was out in the forest on the Wake Road when I had a piece of luck. It was autumn and getting dark at 6, the earliest I'd been able to get there, and I didn't have much hope of any woman being silly enough to walk down that road alone in the dark. I had got off the bus at the Wake Arms and was walking slowly down the hill when I saw this car parked ahead of me at the curb. Even from a distance, I could hear the horrible noise it made as the driver tried to start it. That anguished grinding you get when ignition won't take place. The offside door opened and a woman got out. She was on her own. She reached back into the car and turned the lights off, slammed the door, locked it, and began walking down the hill towards Staten. I had stepped in among the trees and she hadn't seen me yet. I followed her, working out what technique I should use this time. Pursuing her at a run to start with was what I decided on. I came out onto the pavement about 100 yards behind her and began running after her, making as much noise with my feet as I could. Of course, she stopped and turned around as I knew she would. Probably she thought I was a savior who was going to do something about her car for her. She looked round, waiting for me. As soon as I caught her eye, I veered off into the forest once more. She gave a sort of shrug, turned, and walked on. She wasn't frightened yet. It was getting dark, though, and there was no moon. I caught up to her and walked alongside her very quietly, only 3 or 4 yards away, yet in among the trees of the forest. By then we were out of sight of the parked car and a long way from being in sight of the lights of Thaden. The road was dark, though far from being impenetrably black. I trod on a twig deliberately and made it snap, and she turned swiftly and saw me. She jumped. She looked away immediately and quickened her pace. Of course she didn't have a chance with me. A 5-foot woman doesn't with a 6-foot man. The fastest she could walk was still only my strolling pace. There hadn't been a car along the road since I'd been following her. Now one came. I could see its lights welling and dipping a long way off, round the twist in the road. She went to the edge of the pavement and held up her hand the way a hitchhiker does. I stayed where I was to see what would happen. What had I done after all? Only been there. But the driver didn't stop for her. Of course he didn't. No more than I would have done in his place. We all know the sort of man who stops his car to pick up smartly dressed, pretty hitchhikers at night, and we know what he's after. The next driver didn't stop either. I was a little ahead of her by then, still inside the forest, and in his headlights I saw her face. She was pretty. Not that aspect particularly interested me, but I saw that she was pretty and that she belonged to the same type as Carol, a small slender blonde with rather sharp features and curly hair. The darkness seemed much darker after the car lights had passed. I could tell she was a little less tense now. She probably hadn't seen me for the past 5 minutes. She might have thought I'd gone, and I was tempted to call it a day, give up after a quarter of an hour, as I usually did when I'd had my fun. I wish to God I had. I went on with it for the stupidest of reasons. I went on with it because I wanted to go in the same direction as she was going, down into Thaden, and catch the tube train from there, rather than go back and hang about waiting for a bus. I could have waited and let her go. I didn't. Out of some sort of perverse need, I kept her step with her, and then I came out of the forest and got onto the pavement behind her. I walked along, gaining on her but quietly. The road dipped, wound a little. I got 2 or 3 yards behind her, going very softly. She didn't know I was there. And then I began a soft whistling, a hymn tune. It was the Crimin version of The Lord is My Shepherd. What a choice. She spun round. I thought she was going to say something, but I don't think she could. Her voice was strangled by fear. She turned again and began to run. She could run quite fast. That tiny, vulnerable blonde girl. The car lights loomed up over the road ahead. They were full beam, undipped headlights, blazing blue-white across the surrounding forest, showing up every tree and making long black shadows spring from their trunks. I jumped aside and crouched down in the long grass. She ran into the road, holding up both arms and crying, "Help me! Help me!" He stopped. At a moment's tension, when I thought he might get out and come looking for me, but he didn't. He pushed open the passenger door from inside. The girl got in. They waited, sitting there for maybe half a minute, and then the white Ford Capri moved off. It was a relief to me to see the car disappear over the top of the hill, and I realized, to coin a very appropriate phrase, that I wasn't yet out of the wood. What could be more likely than that the girl and the driver would either phone or call in at Loughton police station? I knew I'd better get myself down to Thaden as fast as possible. As it happened, I did so without meeting or being passed by another vehicle. I was walking along by the village green when the only cars I saw came along. On the station platform, I had to wait for nearly half an hour before a train came, but no policeman came either. I had got away with it again, in a way. There are worse things than being punished for one's crime. One of those is not being punished for them. I'm suffering for what I did, of course, by not being allowed, that is, by not allowing myself to do it again. and I shall never forget that girl's face, so pretty and vulnerable and frightened. It comes to me a lot in dreams. The first time it appeared to me was in a newspaper photograph, 2 days later after I had frightened her on the Wake Road. The newspaper was leading on the story of her death, and that was why it used the picture. On the previous morning, when she had been dead 12 hours, her body had been found, stabbed and mutilated, in a field between Epping and Harlow. Police were looking for a man, thought to be the driver of a white Ford Capri. Her rescuer? Her murderer? Then, what was I? The Undead by Robert Bloch. Every evening at 6, Carol took off her glasses, but it didn't seem to help. In the old movie reruns on TV, Cary Grant was always there to exclaim, a mixture of surprise and gentlemanly lust, "Why, you're beautiful without your glasses." No one had ever told Carol that, even though she really was beautiful, or almost so. With her light auburn hair, fair skin, regular features, and sapphire blue eyes, she needed only the benefit of contact lenses to perfect her image. But why bother when Cary Grant wasn't around? The bookshop's customers for first edition and rare manuscripts seemed more interested in caressing parchment than in fondling flesh. And by nightfall the place was empty. Even its owner had departed, leaving Carol to shut up shop, lock the doors, and set the alarms. With a valuable stock on hand, she was always mindful of her responsibility. Or almost always. Tonight, seated in the rear office and applying her lipstick preparatory to departure, she was surprised to hear footsteps moving across the uncarpeted floor in the hall beyond. Carol frowned and put her compact down on the desktop. She distinctly recalled turning out the shop lights, but in her preoccupation with self-pity, could she have forgotten to lock the front entrance? Apparently so, because now the footsteps halted and a figure appeared in the office doorway. Carol blinked at the black blur of the body surmounted by a white blob of head and hair. Then she put on her glasses, and the black blur was transformed into a dark suit. The white blob became the face of an elderly gentleman with a receding hairline. Both his suit and his face were wrinkled, but the old man's dignified bearing overshadowed his sartorial shortcomings and the onslaughts of age, and when he spoke, his voice was resonant. "Good evening. Are you the proprietor of this establishment?" "I'm sorry," Carol said. "He's already left. We're closed for the night." "So I see," the stranger nodded. "Forgive me for intruding at this late hour, but I've traveled a long way and hoped I might still find him here." "We open tomorrow at 10. He'll be here then, or if you'd like to leave a message." "It's a matter of some urgency," the old man said. "Word has reached me that your firm recently came into the possession of a manuscript which supposedly disappeared over 70 years ago." Carol nodded. "That's right. The Dracula original." "You know the novel?" "Of course. I read it years ago." Reaching into his pocket, the stranger produced an old-fashioned calling card and handed it to her. "Then perhaps you will find this name familiar?" Carol peered at the lettering. The Gothic typescript was difficult to decipher, and she repeated out loud what she read. "Abraham Van Helsing?" "Correct," the old man smiled. Carol shook her head. "Wait a minute. You don't expect me to believe that I am the namesake of my great-grandfather, Mynheer Dr. Professor Van Helsing of Amsterdam?" He nodded. "Oh yes, I can assure you that Dracula is not entirely a work of fiction. The identity of some of its characters was disguised, but others, like my illustrious ancestor, appeared under their own names. Now do you understand why I am interested in the original manuscript?" As he spoke, the old man glanced at the safe in the far corner. "Is it too much to hope that you have it here?" "I'm sorry," Carol said. "I'm afraid it's been sold." "Sold?" "Yes. The day after we sent out our announcement, the phone started ringing. I've never seen anything like it. Just about every customer on our mailing list wanted to make a bid, and the final offer we got was simply fantastic." "Could you tell me who purchased the manuscript?" "A private collector. I don't know his name because my boss didn't tell me. Part of the deal was that the buyer would remain completely anonymous. I guess he was afraid somebody would try to steal it from him." The old man's frown conveyed a mingling of anger and contempt. How very cautious of him. But then they were all cautious, concealing something which never truly belonged to any of them. That manuscript has been hidden away all these years because it was stolen in the first place. Stolen from the man to whom the author gave it in gratitude for providing him with the basis of the novel. My own great-grandfather. He stared at Carol. Who brought this to your employer? He didn't tell me that either. It's very hush-hush. You see, just as I told you. He must have known he had no right to possess it. Thieves, all of them. Carol shrugged. Really, I didn't know. Of course. And I'm not blaming you, my dear young lady, but perhaps you can still be of some assistance to me. Did you happen to see the manuscript before it was sold? Yes. Can you describe it? Well, to begin with, it wasn't called Dracula. The handwritten title was The Undead. Ah, yes. The old man nodded quickly. That would be the original. What else can you recall about it? The cover page was in Bram Stoker's handwriting, but the manuscript was typed. The author's changes and editorial corrections were done by hand, and so was the renumbering of the pages. It looked as though a lot of pages had been omitted. Almost 100 at guess, Carol paused. That's really just about all I remember. And more than enough. From your description, there's no doubt it is the genuine manuscript. The old man nodded again. You're sure about pages being omitted? Yes, quite sure, because my boss commented on that. Why? Is it important? Very. It seems Bram Stoker was wiser than his informant, although the published novel does refer to Count Dracula's plan to bring vampirism to England. This motive is not stressed. What the missing pages contained is that Van Helsing revealed about Dracula's ultimate goal, to spread vampirism throughout the world. They also presented factual proof of Dracula's existence, proof, too, convincing to be ignored. Stoker wrote down everything Van Helsing told him, but had second thoughts about including it in his final draft. I wish to make certain, however, that those pages didn't still exist in manuscript form. Now that I know, it won't even be necessary to seek out the new owner. But you talk as though all this is true, Carol said. It's only a novel, and Count Dracula gets killed in the end. Again, an example of Stoker's caution, the old man told her. He had to invent a death scene to reassure his readers. Even so, just think of the influence that novel has had on millions of people who learned of Dracula and vampirism through the book and the theater and films. As it is, many of them still half believe. The resonant voice deepened. What do you think would have happened if Stoker had novelized the story, if he'd written it for what it was, a true account of the actual experiences of Abraham Van Helsing? Even in novel form, if those missing pages still existed, their message might bring a warning to the world which would endanger Dracula's plans. Carol glanced at her watch as he spoke. 6:30. She was getting hungry, and the old man's hang-up was getting on her nerves. She stood up, forcing a smile. This has been very interesting, she said, but I really must close up now. You have been most kind, the old man smiled. It seems a pity you do not entirely believe me, but I speak the truth. Count Dracula is as real as I am. Carol reached for her open compact on the desk. In the oval mirror she saw her reflection, but there was none of her visitor, even though he was standing quite close. Close enough for her to smell the rank breath, see the whiteness of the pointed teeth, feel the surprising strength of the hands that rose now to imprison her in their implacable grip. As he forced her head back, Carol's glasses dislodged, clattering to the floor, and for a moment, her image in the compact mirror was indeed quite beautiful. Then the bright droplets spurted down, blotting it forever.